evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with the former Prime Minister Datuk Sri Najib Razak's Sumpah Laknat, which he undertook after Friday prayers today. Now, a Sumpah Laknat is a religious oath asking for divine retribution in the form of a curse on those who are in the wrong. So it's not officially recognized in Malaysia's Sharia laws, and it's different to the oaths undertaken in Sharia courts here, where one swears by the name of God over their statement. So Najib performed his Sumpah Laknat to deny that he had ordered the killing of Altantuya Shaariibuu. Now, some questions for us to consider tonight. Why perform this Sumpah Laknat, and who is it for?
Well, clearly, I'm not a religious scholar, Melissa, and I don't have an answer, at least from a theological point of view, about the Sumpah Laknat. But I think for his supporters, clearly this is more proof or evidence, I say in quotes, evidence of his honesty and his willingness to put himself out there in terms of the truth, right? So I think for the supporters of Najib Razak, this is a good thing, a good move, because it also is a demonstration of his piety, right? But
his
for the
Islamic
detractors,
fealty.
That's right. So for the detractors, of course, this is just more public dramatics, histrionics, an attempt to sway public opinion using images of himself praying and so on and so forth. They will, of course, bring up a number of counterfactuals. They'll look at other evidence, including the fact that this is a man who now stands accused of robbing the national coffers, and in many jurisdictions around the world. That story is very well established, most recently in the US again. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure, who this is for, apart from the public.
Yeah, or some segments of the public, right? So, it's just this really interesting thing. The Sumpah Laknat in Malaysia has been utilized before, particularly in political sex scandals. We've seen several times now where people have come up to say that they were willing to take a Sumpah Laknat to prove their innocence whenever accused of being involved in a sex scandal. Now, there's also people being involved in allegations of graft, taking on the Sumpah Laknat. And I'm wondering whether the challenge, when you're challenged to take a Sumpah Laknat, when in public you have been said, oh, well, if you are innocent, then why don't you perform a Sumpah Laknat to show your innocence? And the optics of not performing that when challenged. I wonder how that goes down with certain segments of the public.
Yeah, absolutely, But I think, Melissa, in some ways, it also goes back to the way in which the public can make a distinction between, declarations of piety or declarations of innocence versus statements of truth. I mean, just because you say you are honest doesn't mean that you are. For instance, and just because something ought to be done doesn't mean it is being done. And so those kind of subtle distinctions, I think sometimes are missing in the mix of this discussion.
Okay, well, let's turn our attention now to Australia, where the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has apologized for going on holiday in Hawaii this week, while the country's bushfire crisis there worsened. There is an interesting contrast in response to the situation in Johor. So the Johor Menteri Besar's office has actually defended Dr. Shahruddin Jamal's overseas trip after he was criticized of being away, this as thousands of orang asli were cut off by floods in Mersing.
Yeah, I think we've come, Melissa, to criticize our politicians quite vigorously, over...
That's a good thing, right?
Yeah, it is a good thing. But, over perceived, lack of concern about the public or their desire to travel extensively on the public purse, so on and so forth. But I think maybe we have to look at the question of flooding. The one possible angle on this is not so much his failure to turn up or cancel his trip and so on and so forth, but whether Johor itself, because this flooding is a regular occurrence, has put in place the mechanisms or systems to deal and manage with the flooding, so that actually his presence isn't necessary.
Right.
In terms of managing the situation on the ground.
So you're saying if there has, because it is a regular occurrence, if there was actually a systematic disaster management approach, then we really don't even need our politicians to be on the ground. But what about the question of optics? And this was something that we touched on a bit earlier. The question of optics, because every by-election or even general election we talk about candidates having a presence on the ground, whether they're known by the people. And I think with these natural disasters is a great way to show empathy of the politicians, being there, experiencing the same types of deprivations that come with natural disasters will go a long way at the ballot box.
Yeah, it might be good politics, but it isn't necessarily good governance. And also, to be fair to all, I think, involved, it's sometimes what the public does is to weigh the importance of that event. You went overseas. In this case, it was about promoting education and along with other agencies, foreign agencies. Was that more important than showing the empathy? I'm not sure. Okay. But clearly, at the end of the day, the politicians will weigh up the trade-offs.
Right. Very quickly, I want to ask you, in comparison to the story that I brought up earlier in Australia with the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, do you see that the similarities or distinctions to be made here? Because Scott Morrison was on holiday in Hawaii versus a working trip, to do with the state resources and state future.
Right. Okay. So there are two other dimensions that perhaps come into play. One is the severity of the situation in Australia. I think the death of several firemen, I think, was also what precipitated his concern or his need to express his concern. The question of the severity of the Johor floods, of course, the people who are suffering the deprivations will feel that this is the worst thing that could possibly happen to them. So politicians, could he have deputized individuals to take his place in this event? Yeah, he could have. I mean, the question is, as you say, the optics and how the politicians weigh that up.
All right, in other news, we have the Cato Institute recently releasing the Human Freedom Index 2019, which looks to measure the state of human freedom in the world. This is encompassing personal, civil and economic freedoms in the absence of coercive constraints. So let's look at Malaysia's ranking. Malaysia ranked 106 out of 162 countries, having fallen 3 places from last year. That's not very good. We're currently sandwiched between Bhutan and Nepal. And as always with these league tables, we often check out what Singapore's ranking is. Singapore is at 30th spot, unchanged from last year. So 30th compared to our 106.
Right. Okay, so in all these things, I mean, I think being overly concerned with the ranking is always a problem. I think what would be really interesting is the media took this seriously and looked at the breakdown. Because when you look at each of the elements in the calculation for the overall number, you have very interesting expressions of types of, I would say, value systems, right? What is it that that this particular index represents in terms of values? What exactly and how they define freedom, I think, is very important. Also, it must be noted when it comes to ranking, sometimes you fall 3 places not because you have declined in the scores, but because others have improved. And so I think what this report also does is allows you to see how Malaysia, at least from the viewpoint of those who constructed this index, have either improved or, have declined in our performance over the years. So that, I think, is also worthy of a conversation, at least.
Definitely. One of the things that I thought was interesting, I zoomed out, not just to look at how Malaysia did, but in particular the effects of populism and especially authoritarian populism and that effect on freedom that can be seen in this report. If you take a look at, say, Turkey, for instance, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, his increasingly autocratic leadership has seen a notable decline for Turkey in terms of liberty within the decade. Among the 10 regions in the world, the largest drop of freedom since 2008 has occurred in the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, also considered the region with the least freedoms.
Well, because it's interesting because we just had the KL summit that purportedly brings leaders of Muslim nations together, looking at things like development, but also the question of Islamophobia. The question of freedom, though, and I don't think it's big on the agenda. And you look at many of the faces of the KL summit, they're not exactly icons of freedom and democracy. So this is one of the problems, I think, also that this index helps kind of highlight. At least it creates a conversation, I think, very important.
Exactly. And speaking of that, we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about the KL summit and take a closer look at what it tells us about the prevailing tensions in the Muslim world. Stay tuned to consider this. We'll be right back.